This is a little out of sequence. Writing the protocol should immediately come after this, identifying a good question. You've been through that.
It's again happening.
I believe in the morning. Better worse same. Which can be answered by you in a measurable manner and provide an answer. And I couldn't help it because I read that paper which is given to you. The last line is, further studies are required. And nothing annoys an editor more, because the question is, if further studies are required, do the further study and submit. What is the hurry in submitting? And definitely there's no hurry in publication. Right? So the only person in a hurry is the author. So please don't put in that sentence at any point. So we all know what a good question is. So if you understand what a good question is, it's easy to write the introduction, because that's where you are highlighting the lacuna in current knowledge. You are showing the method, because that's how you are going to answer it. The results and analysis are the measurements which you have done to answer the question, and the conclusion is the answer which you are providing. So if you have framed your research question well, you're 3/4 way there to writing your protocol in a good manner, which is, yeah, that sounds alright. Yeah, in a good manner which can be approved by all. Now, when you write an introduction, you must be short. Now, the paper which is given, there's a foolscap page on, and I think even I, though I'm not an ophthalmologist, the first paragraph is known to me. So that must be a very pretty basic level information. So if you actually need to write an introduction, there is no need to state in detail what is obvious. Human beings have two eyes, left eye, right eyes. Sometimes they move together, sometimes one can go a little bit off, that's a squint. That is not really required. And definitely not history. So Columbus started, then the first cataract was detected on the boat he was on his way to India, but actually the boat went to America. We don't really want to know all that. So you need to just say what you're doing new and why are you doing it. And this is the so what, who cares. Unless you can highlight so what and who cares, no one is going to read your protocol further. Because all research is about providing an answer to an important question which matters to somebody. So you answer this and people will read forward, otherwise you will find that your protocol is left to the side. Then you write the methods. You start with the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So who are you going to take as part of your research? Who are you going to leave out? Now here you must resist the tendency, I am going to take men, I am going to leave out women. That's obvious. So you have to be careful how you write it. You need to keep the design very tight. The reason is that your protocol may not just be applied by you. You're supposed to write it in a manner that you just give that document to your neighbor and he should be able to do the study in exactly the same way that you would do it. Right? So if you want men between the age of 18 and 65, say it. You want them with a particular type of vision, say it. If you want to exclude certain diseases, say it. If you want to include certain types, say it. And don't use terms like I'm measuring those who are hypertensive, diabetic, because all diabetes is not the same. So if you have someone whose blood sugar is routinely 350 and is taking 60 units of insulin per day, that's not the same diabetic as somebody who's been told by the doctor that you can't eat sweets and you take, 2 rounds of the garden and then your sugar stays under control because the level is just above normal. So you must be very tight in your definition. Who am I calling diabetic? Who am I calling hypertensive? Who am I analyzing? And who am I including? And write it in such a manner that anybody else will also use and be able to select the same patients that you will be from your protocol. The other important thing is to exclude confounding factors. Now, confounding factors are what will dilute your results. So, for example, I'm sure there are 40 things that affect the result of anything you do. And you're using two different techniques. if your patient has all the 40 factors in different proportions, then you might find that they can't see later for 40 different reasons. Not just because you did something different, better, worse, or whatever. So you must make sure that what you have is a relatively tight group of patients where you have thought that all these other things can also affect my results. Make sure that you have taken care of that either in the randomization so that they're equal in each arm so that balances each other out, or you remove these patients so that they're not affecting your overall conclusion because you're looking at one thing. Your good research question always answers one thing. So you must exclude all the confounding factors because it is far better to study a large number properly, sorry, a small number properly than to study a large number badly. Because the only way you can answer your question is if you have a small group where you've done everything properly, excluded all the confounding factors, and you have conclusively said, yes, my intervention works or my intervention doesn't work. Right. When you write your methods down, you must write them down as you would in a journal article for publication with that much detail. Now this has many advantages. It's not just saying that this procedure done. If you write down all the steps, you will realize all the flaws before you begin your study. So then you will realize that I will need so many hours of OT time, I will need this equipment to measure this, I don't have it. I will need this laboratory support, I have to budget for it. And it clears your thoughts. And this is the only way you can be truly prospective in your data collection. Because everything has been put in advance. I am looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 45. So your pro forma will automatically have those 45 factors. So if you write everything in detail in the methods of your protocol, then it will help you in your data collection and it will help you in your publication. Now, numbers are something that is very tricky. It's a very common question. How many patients do I need to include for my study to make sense? Now here, a biostatistician will really help you. Now if you have a good basic knowledge of statistics, you can usually do your own calculation. But if you're beginning, it's always wise to take advice from someone who knows statistics or a biostatistician. I think Nitya's had a go at sample size calculation. So you have some idea that you can email Nitya, even if you're stuck somewhere. Always remember the GIGO principle, garbage in, garbage out. And she must have told you that unless you give adequate information to the biostatistician, because a biostatistician or an ophthalmologist doesn't understand anything of what you're doing. So unless you tell them properly what is the reported literature, what is the expected incidence, what is the difference I'm expecting, they are never going to be able to give you a correct answer as to how many you need. If they give you the wrong answer to how many you need, you might be very happy. Oh, they said only 7 patients are needed. You do 7 patients, at the end of it, you've not answered anything. So you've actually cut your own foot off by not giving them good information right at the beginning. You must also take into account how we are going to analyze this data prospectively, which means what are the tests I'm going to do, how am I going to make my tables, how am I going to enter my data. The reason for this is that you have a general idea of what you're collecting and you had a brief overview of statistical tests also. So the statistician will help you say that, okay, you need the chi-square test, you need the Mann-Whitney test, or whatever test you require. Often it happens that you will finish the paper and then you will try and do some sort of jugglery to get the p-value 0.05. That is fraud. So if you know prospectively that this is the best way to analyze the data, so be it. If you don't get significance, that means that you have not proved the point and you do a larger study, or you accept that maybe the hypothesis has been disproved, or take things further from that point. But you cannot take the data and then try and find something that suits you, because that is actually altering the truth, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Cross-disciplinary projects. And this is something that is very important to understand. A lot of us would be doing studies which involve other departments and other specialities, and we may often not understand them. Now, the previous speaker, Dr. Biswas, he's done a lot of work on tuberculosis. He's used PCR. Now, you need to understand PCR. a little bit or speak to someone who does PCR before you plan that in your study. The reason for that is, supposing they tell you that I need fresh tissue, I cannot take formalinized tissue, or if the tissues in formalin has to be neutral buffered formalin and cannot be a routine formalin that's available in the shop, then only will I be able to extract the DNA from this tissue. And you don't know that, and you collect your 100 samples, and then you give it to the microbiologist, then they say, sorry, I can't do any PCR from this bad luck, and your 5 years data has gone down the drain. So understand the techniques before you actually go ahead and apply this. And from this, I think there are a lot of lessons from, Kaun Banega Crorepati. This is a very famous TV program. All of you must have watched it with all sorts of charming presenters. So the first thing they do when they're stuck is ask the audience. So if you do not understand the techniques, you have some doubts about your protocol, there will be someone else next to you in your department, in your hospital, in your neighboring institution, someone you studied with in college, who will know the answer. So ask around. Everyone will help each other. Who will refuse to help you? Phone a friend. Every journal article will have an email. So if someone has done similar studies abroad, for example, and you're looking for a positive control or a negative control for some molecular test, you just email them that, excuse me, could you please send it to me? And most scientists would be happy to help other scientists and be able to send it to you. So use these people to help improve your design and what you're actually going to be able to achieve. The next is the 50-50. Make these lab people your co-investigators. When you're writing your protocol, say that yes, mine is a very heavily lab-based project, there's a molecular biology test involved. I would like you to be a co-investigator with me, sign the protocol. The moment that happens, responsibility comes on them. The moment they're responsible, then they will contribute with you and be your partner, and they will take interest in what you're doing, and it will be much more fruitful. So involve them right at the planning stage so that they can go through what you're doing and actually help you. And at the end of it, you're not got anywhere flip. It's better to do something else because your project is bound to fail if it involves some complex lab test and you don't have any help on board for doing this. You need to think through flaws very carefully. Do I have a gold standard? Because often you have, two tests compared with each other. Then you say, then what is actually the gold standard? And you find out the gold standard is one of the tests that you're actually comparing. So you cannot use a test to compare itself. So you need to see, do I have a gold standard? Do I have all the controls? Have I thought of all the confounding factors? And most importantly, at the end of it, I'm trying to answer my question. So that is the conclusion. Will the conclusions be based on the facts that I find? And if you feel that the facts that you have put into your methods are not enough to answer your conclusions, that means you need to find out more facts. So then, if you need to do more, that is the time to put it into your protocol and add it, rather than do 100 patients and then find out, oh, I should have done this test, and this test also. And you can't call those 100 patients back to repeat all those investigations. So think through once you finish that do I have enough to conclude satisfactorily. When you write your proforma, it is important to keep the rubbish out. See, everyone starts off with name, age, sex, address, occupation, whatever. Do you really want to know his address? Don't your medical records have it? Do you really want to know his occupation? Are you going to analyze that when you write your paper? If not, why is it in your proforma? Your proforma is a summary of information you're going to analyze. To make it easy, you have to make it in a yes-no format. So if you're going to ask for diabetes, hypertension, whatever, which you have predefined, it's better to say diabetes, yes, no, hypertension, yes, no, whatever, yes, no, rather than say any comorbid illnesses and then you write diabetes, hypertension by hand. Because this yes, no is much easier to count. Think of it, you have an Excel sheet, you put in yes as 1 and no as 0. You have 20 headings and your spreadsheet can go down to 2000 columns, it doesn't matter to you. And then all you do is sum. And it adds up all the ones. And without having to count anything yourself, the number of ones are the number of people who have that illness. While if you actually wrote down diabetes and typed it in manually, then you'll have to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And believe me, if you counted 3 times manually, you get 3 different answers. So it is much easier to do it in this yes, no, 0-1 format and have a bigger spreadsheet, because your computer doesn't use paper, space is available for you indefinitely. And if you do it in this format, it is easy to analyze. Always have an electronic and a text copy. You need a text copy in case someone steals your laptop or your hard disk crashes or whatever happens. You need an electronic copy in case you have the floods of 2005 and something drowns out all your work and all the ink smudges, or the rats come and eat it up, or your file gets lost. So always keep it in both formats. Fill it up as your project progresses. Never keep your pro forma as something which you're going to fill up right at the end. And the reason for that is that you can sort of keep looking at it every 10 patients, 15 patients in a simple manner and see, do I need more information? Are there any confounding factors? So all the things I talked about before, because after 10 patients, you can change. After 100, 500, you'll never be able to change. So keep filling it up, keep looking at it, keep analyzing it, and give you some ideas whether you can make some changes. Then you can reapproach the ethics committee, say I want these 2 minor modifications, I'm recording this much more, and they'll be very happy to give you permission to do that. I'll be talking about consent a bit later, so I will not speak about it. This is a very important point. Patients do not pay for your research. And especially in private practice, this is a little bit of a problem. Then you think you have a very nice procedure on hand. You think it is better than the existing procedure. You don't have proof for it, but you're trying to study it, and then the patient has to foot the full bill for your work. That is really not ethical. You need to find some way. If you are doing research, you know that you're not using standard of care. You know that you're not using established treatment. It's not for a single case as a eye-saving situation or life-saving situation. It is as a study that you're going to do over the next 2 or 3 years. You will have to find funding for it. There is no way that patients are going to pay for what is research work. Therefore, you need an accurate cost breakdown, because unless you have an accurate cost breakdown, how do you know what you're going to budget for? And in expensive projects, always have a phased budget, especially if you're approaching a funding agency. And you'll be surprised what the DBT, DST, ICMR, they're all willing to fund you if you're from a big institute. And probably not if you're a single person in practice, but from an institute, they'll definitely fund you. And in which case, they will say, okay, first year you take this much, second year you take this much. Because at the end of 1 year, if you really not achieved much, all that money is not dropped, all the money is not wasted. And the rest of it can be saved and used for something better. You need to be very realistic about the time frame. You have to say that I will collect my patients for inclusion in the first so many months. I will do my procedures over the next so many months. I will analyze this data at this point, and it will be presented and completed at the end of so many. Unless you have the time frame which is realistic, you are never going to finish your study and you are never going to reach the stage of publication. And this also helps tells how far behind you are in what you are actually trying to do. It is usually a waste to do a project that is not publishable. If you've done your pro forma in this format, you already have the introduction. The methods are exactly as you write it for publication. So it's already in a format where you can just convert it into a publishable text. Your tables have been prepared, your statistical analysis methods have been described. So all you need to do now is write the discussion and the conclusions, and that's the end of it. So if the pro forma is perfect, then you just need to add the results and conclusions, and you will be able to publish it quickly. So I will end the first talk at this point. If there are any questions, I will take them. Otherwise, I'll just proceed with the remaining ones.
Any questions?
Excellent.
Thank you. That's should I move on? I think this is not the next one.
Okay.
Practically summarize what has been taught right from the beginning.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't here, so that means I repeated everything. I
No,
apologize for that.
we needed it because I think one thing we have learned is that you are not alone, and if you are alone, also ask everybody, like your phone banega crorepati, I think is summarize, and the idea is to improve.
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about informed consent. And you can't really talk about informed consent without appreciating the history of the patient interest movement. So why are they moving on so? Okay. So why is there medical research? We actually want patients to either live longer, live healthier, you want them to see better, you want them to be overall happy with their lives. And for this we need to know more about health and disease. Right? So there's no disagreement on that point. So the next question is, should we harm people during research? Anyone feels we should harm people during research? So obviously no one wants to harm people. Do we harm people during research? Sometimes,
Unintentional.
it is unintentional, but it happens. Does the participant benefit by research?
Yes, many times.
How?
A lot of expensive drugs are sometimes available free of cost.
Absolutely. So there is a potential for benefit and harm, but there is also potential for harm. So we need to understand this concept of patient safety. And it's a relatively new concept. It's quite interesting. The first randomized controlled trial was done by Frederick II. He was a king in what is today Israel, Lebanon, that area. And this was, we're talking about 1200 AD. That's a pretty long time back. And his physician told him that, you exercise after a meal, your digestion will improve. So he said, I don't believe you, let us conduct an experiment. So he got 2 nights. So both of them were given a feast. One was put to sleep, the other was sent on a jog, so he was made to run for 6 hours. At the end of 6 hours, both were killed. And the intestines were taken out to see how far has that meal progressed. And it was seen that the one who went all over the place, the food had gone into the ileum, and the one was lying in bed, the food had just barely passed the stomach. So he's told his doctor, yes, I've done my experiment and you're right, that if you exercise, then definitely digestion does improve, and you're quite right. Now, I'm not sure that many ethics committees would approve of this protocol. So,
You can send one and see.
you can send one and see, you'll get a few interesting remarks. But it is not just the old days. A lot of you may have heard about this. This was often taught in PSM, though I slept through it at that time. But this is a tremendously interesting study, the Tuskegee study. Yeah, a lot of you are aware of this?
No.
Between 1932 and 1972, right? So it went 40 years, and 72 is not a very long time back. It was funded by the US government, so it's not some emperor somewhere doing his own thing. It's the US government, similar but not quite, but ultimately still a government body. And they used illiterate black sharecroppers. Sharecroppers are like our bonded laborers. So there were a lot of these farms where black workers were working, on daily wages. And they wanted to study the natural history of syphilis. So it was a cohort, and a lot of them had very interesting lives. They caught syphilis. And in 1932, there was no treatment for syphilis because penicillin came in the 40s. So they said that we'll just watch these patients and we will learn the natural history of syphilis. So they didn't tell the patient that syphilis. They said you had bad blood. Right? So they withheld information. They said we'll give all your health care free. Now that wasn't because they were nice people. They said we give all your health care free because it assured that the patients would only come to them for treatment. So every time they have headache, body ache, neck pain, tabies dorsalis, neuropathy, everything will be reported to that doctor because he is giving them free treatment. Penicillin was discovered in 46. It was found to be a cure for syphilis by the 50s, established. But till 72, these patients were not offered penicillin because they were studying the natural history. And they didn't even know they had syphilis because no one had told them. So there's no way they could even have asked for treatment. And if they said that if you die, we'll give you $50 for a burial casket. And the reason wasn't that they were nice and say, okay, now the study is terminated, we're giving you a little bit of money. The reason for that was that they could do an autopsy on them. So they would have pathology specimens of all organs to see why the person had died of syphilis and what had happened to all the organs. So this is a government-sponsored body, and you can see, how many things are there. So each and every principle of what we consider ethical research today has been knocked off by this. And we know that there are a lot of Nazi wartime experiments which were on similar lines. And after World War II, good clinical practice actually evolved. So the Nuremberg Code, which was found, the courts of Nuremberg who tried all these war criminals, all these doctors who did this unethical research, put the first line that the voluntary consent of human subjects is absolutely essential. So they started off by saying that unless the person consents, you cannot do any study. And that consent is not by a gun pointing at the head, it is a voluntary consent. And then this has all been modified. You have the Declaration of Helsinki, you have the ICH GCP guidelines, you have the ICMR guidelines, I think this is 2006, I think that's a little misprint, and you have the CDSCO guidelines of 2001. And these guidelines are important, and I'll come to that, because we need to understand that patient safety, it is tedious for researchers, it is tedious for pharma, because you have to do so many things to protect the patient's interest. You have to pay money in case they have a complication, look after them. So for the people who design the study, it appears to be tedious, but patient safety is good for patients because, you know, though they only take part, they are quite concerned about what happens to them in the study. In India, we have something called Schedule Y. And if you are embarking on any sort of study involving drugs or devices, you must read this. It's a 38-page document. It is available on PDF. Just put Schedule Y into Google. And this is actually the law. It is a modification of the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1945. It makes the ICMR and CDSCO guidelines compulsory. So guideline is actually a guideline. You know, it's like the lines we have on the road, you know. So it's not necessary that the car will actually stay on the side of the road because of the line is there. You know, that's a general rule which we tend to follow sometimes while driving in Bombay. But because Schedule Y makes the guidelines compulsory, the guidelines have now become the law, and all our research has to follow ICMR and CDSCO guidelines. And this is very important to understand because you might have some drug trial from the US and they will tell you all the FDA regulations have been fulfilled. We don't care. Have the ICMR and CDSCO guidelines been fulfilled or not? That is what we need to look at. It tells the role and composition of the ethics committee, and it has the blueprint for the consent form. And what you need to design are two separate pieces of paper. One is the form itself which the patient will sign, and the second is the patient information sheet. And it doesn't matter if you can't read this. I think you have a printout in your file. It doesn't matter if you don't have a printout because this is part of Schedule Y. I've taken it from Schedule Y. It tells you exactly what your informed consent pro forma should be. So by law, if you're doing a drug trial or a device trial today, you have to use this pro forma, right? So you put the name, initials, date of birth, whatever. I confirm I have read and understood the information sheet. So the patient information sheet dated this date, and I have the opportunity to ask you questions about it. First line. So tick. I understand that my participation is voluntary and I'm free to withdraw at any time, giving any reason without my medical care being affected or my legal rights. So I can walk out of the study and you can't do anything to me, you have to treat me the same. I understand that the sponsor of the clinical trials and other working on the behalf of ethics committee will not need my permission to look at the health record, so that actually helps you. So the patient is giving him permission so that you can go through the health records, and that's all about that. But I understand my identity will not be revealed. So you cannot say that Gonduram Panduram, you know, that name has to be blocked out whenever you're doing anything. There can be a unique identification number which is linked to the records. I agree not to restrict use of data or results that arise from this study provided the use is for scientific purposes. So that allows you to publish all the data that you're collecting. And I agree to take part in the above study. And with the signature of the investigator. So you as an investigator have to sign the form, and there has to be an independent, impartial witness who will also sign the form. So this is a very standard pro forma which will come with every consent. Now what actually changes is the patient information sheet. Right. Now the patient information sheet is for you to write. This should have information on your study which is in an easily comprehensible format which the patient can understand relate to, which should explain the risks and, if any, the benefits, without giving undue incentive to the patient to be part of your study, in a language which the patient can actually deal. Right? Now, we have a lot of watchdogs of biomedical ethics. You have the Committee on Publication Ethics, and this is a whole flowchart which I have put in of all the actions that can be taken if you submit an article to a journal and you have not followed all this. And it ends with medical registration can be cancelled at the bottom. So it's quite interesting. So you'll be a little careful about doing studies where you're not looking at.
Or you don't have registration.
In which case you're the perfect person to do a study. Right. So the question I'm commonly asked is, do all papers need a patient consent? Right? Any prospective study on a human being, any prospective study, needs an ethics committee clearance and consent. Any prospective study of a human being. Now there's a concept of waiver of consent which the ethics committee will tell you. So for example, if you just want to audit your work prospectively, you want to see what is happening to my cataracts, what happened to my glaucoma surgery, you're prospectively collecting this data. You're not opening a whole couple of case files. You're going to collect the data in future. You are doing your perfect clinical care. You are not doing anything different to the patient. You just want to collect the data so you can publish it. Then the ethics committee may say that as long as you're not revealing the identity, blah, 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 you don't have to take specific permission of the patient for you to do this audit. You're welcome to do the audit. But they will give you the waiver. On the other hand, you say that I have got developing a new technique of cataract and I want to prospectively study it on the next 100 patients. They will say, we are jolly well not giving you a waiver. You are doing a new technique. You will write a patient information sheet which is saying what is new in my technique, how is it different from the old technique, what are the precautions in case there is a complication of this, who is going to pay for the complications, how will all that be dealt with, what is your contact number in case of emergency. Get the patient to sign that along with the informed consent form, and that will be a formal informed consent and not a waiver of consent. Okay? Now a consent is valid only if the patient is competent, the consent is voluntary, the information on the patient information sheet is comprehensive and comprehensible. I'll go through this a little later. You had free discussion, there are no incentives, and the patient has been informed of all his rights. It should be explained in lay terms to make it comprehensible to the patient. All ethics committees will demand a local language translation and back translation. Right? So our ethics committee will say you have it in English, you have it in Hindi, and you have it in Marathi. So depending on where you come out, it will be Tamil, Telugu, whatever, Bengali, whichever language is prevalent in your area. And the back translation is required. So a certified translator will retranslate that into English, obviously not the same one who translated in the first place, because the ethics committee cannot be expected to know all the local languages. So you want the back translation to make sure that in both, in science and in spirit, that it has captured the original patient information sheet which was submitted to the ethics committee. And all relevant information should be down in clear terms, down to I'm collecting 5 cc of blood, you're having 2 surgeries, 1 surgery, everything should be there. The patient has a right to withdraw at any time, we read that. The right to emergency help in case there's a problem. The right not to pay for treatment and complications arising from the treatment that you're giving. So you are studying a new procedure, there's a complication, you have to have arrangements to pay for that. And the right to more information. So if they want to ask any questions, they have a right to do that. And you're required to put your contact number on the patient information sheet so that they can call you at any time if they feel that there's a problem because they are part of the study. So that number has to be given and that number has to be available. Incentives should not be given. You cannot pay a person to do clinical research. So you cannot say 10,000 rupees be part of my study. There cannot be exaggerated promises. This is the magic new cure for cancer. Why don't you try it? You cannot say things like that. You can say that this drug may benefit, it may not benefit. There might be side effects to this drug. You might be the placebo arm, in which case you not got the drug at all. And that will be decided by somebody else, and neither you nor I will know whether you're getting the study drug. All that has to be explained. And it's important that that is put in black and white in the patient information sheet. So I'll just end informed consent at this point if there are any doubts, queries on this subject. No questions at all? No.
So
Yes.
if you've been doing a particular surgical technique
Right.
already and the patient is anyway paying for it, like say we're not, say it's a normal private paying patient and I want to do a study on it,
Right.
I have to still get them to sign a separate
No,
consent.
you're auditing your results.
But it's a prospective, it's not a
No, but you're prospectively auditing your results.
so that doesn't.
See, you're not doing a scientific study.
No, it's not a new procedure. I mean, technically it's new, but they were going to do it anyway. I'm just going
So
to
you're
study the results.
prospectively auditing your results.
So there's no consent.
That is not a science. But if you're modifying a technique
Right.
and then you want to do it on the next 100 patients and publish,
In these cases, can we get a waiver for the consent?
You have to apply for
We
waiver.
need
for this you have to apply for waiver, because
You
the
apply
moment
for
you send it to a good journal, they will say, where is your ethics committee clearance? It's a human study. So then you'll have to say that I went to the ethics committee and get a waiver.
Any research must either have waiver or have a number.
Because it is prospective. Now, if you're doing it retrospectively, that you've already done the 100 surgeries, you're taking out your case files, that's fine.
That also needs waiver. Isn't it? Institutional review body.
Archival would demand waiver in the US, but maybe not in Europe, and maybe in our country also we're a little flexible about archival.
Okay. But IRB gives waiver for even retrospective study. for-
Yes, they will.
Because it's already.
You can always obtain it because that is something that is non-controversial. You just have to write a letter, you'll get a reply. And I think Dr. Natarajan's also heard this talk, so I think somewhere it sort of clinicians tend to relate to this talk, so just bear with me for the next half an hour or so. See, the I word, I wish I had written the paper. It's a very personal and philosophical subject. So, moment I comes in, you're all ophthalmologists, not that sort of I, but this I would be about, not really science. So we come to the bottom line of why do people write papers? And there's, many reasons. It's, some people have to, there's some PhD, DMD, you're in a teaching institute, unless you write 2 papers, you aren't promoted, your salary stays the same. So you're forced into it. Some people say, I publish in Lancet, I have foreign publications, so I'm not going to look at all these Indian journals. So they're not really publishing for any reason other than to say that, I'm a very important and big person and I actually know how to write. So it's, some people actually do research to discover the truths. And this is a small subset, but this is, I feel, a very good reason to actually do research. So that brings us to the philosophical question of who reveals the true part to us? I mean, do we really know the truth? Because we're all practicing medicine and we're being taught, we have teachers, we have peers, we have our textbooks, and we have peer-reviewed publications, and we read all this and we practice. That the average reader may not be able to pick up flaws. Which is why research methodology is very important, not just from the aspect of writing papers, but from reading it. Because if you know how to design a study properly, you can spot a badly designed study from 20 miles off. And then this sort of design, how do you get their consent for an experimental surgical procedure? It's a big intervention. And how do you go about blinding? Now, blinding obviously not in the ophthalmology sense, but in the general sense of disguising from the patient what has actually been done. So even if you're comparing a medical and a surgical procedure, how do you disguise that surgery has been done in one and there has been medicine in the other? Can you just slash across and say that I put a cut on you? Interestingly, you can, because there have been sham craniectomies in neurosurgery, one very famous randomized controlled trial. But these are very complex issues about surgical studies, which is why this is a paper which I've chosen as, a great paper from the study design point of view, and something that, I wish I could design studies as beautiful as this. So this is a randomized prospective single blind comparison of laparoscopic cholecystectomy versus small incision cholecystectomy. Right? It's close to my heart. This is, I remove gallbladders all the time. But all of you should be interested because this is the commonest abdominal surgery that is done, and there's a good chance that 5 of you at some time or the other will have your gallbladder removed. So this is a fairly important subject. Now, when lap chole came in, you know, chota incision, laser, we can just little thing we get the gallbladder out. Who wants a big cut? So it was just taken up, and there were a whole host of new instruments, new equipment. So Johnson & Johnson, all the companies were pushing it that you have to buy the laparoscopy set, you do it, best technique. And the whole world got convinced to the extent that 5 years after lap chole came in, 3 times the number of gallbladders were removed in the US than before that. It's not that in 5 years the incidence of gallstones increased. It's just that it was so easy to convince a patient, you know, we'll just puncture and we'll get the gallbladder out. We send you home in 1 day, no big cut. And people would just come in for surgery by the dozen. So in that circumstance, it was deemed unethical to even question the fact that lap chole is better, though there was no study proving it. So, I said ethically how will you do a study? It's so obvious it's better, no cut versus no cut. And the obvious advantages to the procedure, and the investment by the industry also, you know, made it difficult to question, because suddenly you found your funding for conferences disappears, your department research fund is half. If you try and question that lap chole is not the best way. Right? So the other problem was you do not take into account in lap chole what affects the beliefs of the patient and carer. If you tell someone you're going to go home the next day, you are going to recover faster, you are going to get less pain, they will go home the next day, they will recover faster. And because they've been convinced they'll have less pain, they'll have less pain. So this is an inherent bias in laparoscopic surgery. You are trying to tell them in advance it's a better procedure. So they want to believe it. So this was a beautiful protocol, I'll just put it up, to try and decide how much pain the patient had. They had 4 surgeons operating on trial patients, so you know, who had actually done both procedures. So they took out the skill element. Sealed envelope was opened in the operation theatre after anesthesia. So the patient had no clue whether they were going for the lap or the open, right? So the patient was blinded, so single blinded. The trial folder was kept separate from the patient notes. So when the patient came to OPD, even the nurse did not know. The person who was measuring the pain score did not know whether it was a lap procedure or an open procedure. So beautifully it was blinded to take out the observer biases within the study. And this picture shows the dressing they did. So whether you are lap or you are open, you had the bandage of the open surgery and you had the 3 bandages, because you do lap chole through 4 pods. So 1, 2, 3 plus that big one. So whatever surgery you had, you have the same bandage. And to mimic blood, they put betadine spots on all the 4 bandages. So even by looking at the dressing, you know, some patients smart to say, this one's got a little bit of blood on it, I must have had an open. Or these 3 have blood on it, must be a lap. They put betadine spots so that the patient could look in the mirror and see what type of surgery. So to this extent, they went to disguise from the patient and the observers which was each arm. Right? So the research nurse was unaware of the operation, and this is all the analysis of the statistics in the standard format. And look at the results. Lap chole took longer. The operative time you can see is more. Is there a pointer here? Or, yes, sorry. Right? So lap chole took more, 69 minutes versus 45 minutes. So it takes time to set up the equipment. Right? Everything, the time to the first feed was significantly better in lap, but if you see the difference, it's by 2 hours. So patients ate 2 hours quicker. Right? So that's, I don't know whether it's clinically relevant. And the remaining hospital stay, time of work, returning to full activity was exactly the same. So at the end of the study, complications were the same. They concluded that a prospective randomized trial of surgery can be done. It is possible to do it to eliminate bias against either procedure. So the beauty of the study was that they showed that you can actually do this sort of study provided your design, you know, what you've done before you started the study is so perfect that you can eliminate all bias. And even today, if you see the latest Cochrane review, it will conclude that laparoscopic and small incision chole seem to be equivalent. No differences could be observed. So till today, the findings of this study, they've stood the test of time. that whatever studies have been done subsequently, you can't show much difference in pain score, recovery, going to work. Right? So this is actually the Cochrane review. So again we come back to the I word, it's a personal, very philosophical thing. This is what I call the Mona Lisa study. Right? Absolutely beautiful, work of art, exquisite technique, very rare. But is it clinically useful? If someone gave you the Mona Lisa for your birthday, what do you do with it? You can't even sell it because someone's obviously stolen it to give it to you. So you have absolutely no value for it. Right? So has anyone stopped doing lab coding? Like today if you went, or you came to me, I'll give you a lab coding. Right? We are getting quicker and better, so the time difference is no longer relevant. I'll probably take the same time to do both. And so what if the patient recover faster only because they believe that they have to recover faster? What difference does it make as long as they are recovering faster? I don't care. So even if it is a placebo, a sham, a psychology, as long as my patient is recovering faster, I don't care. So I will still do lab. So though it is a magnificent study, it has no clinical relevance today. So this is where we come to the beauty of evidence-based medicine. And I don't know whether you had a talk on evidence-based medicine. So I don't know whether this definition came up. This is from Trisha Greenhaw. She's written a very nice book on how to read a paper. So in the use of mathematical estimates, so you have numbers of the risk of benefit and harm derived from high-quality research on a population sample, right? So you studied a population, high-quality research, and you are going to use that data to treat the individual sitting in front of you in your outpatient or in your hospital. So that is the meaning of evidence-based medicine. So you're not taking out the clinical skill, you still have clinical decision making, but you're using this information that you got from high-quality research. So as Dr. Nayak told you, even a simple observation can be meaningful. And I put this slide up in all my talks. So there's the thalidomide baby, all of you must be identifying it. The flipper limbs, the Phocomania. And this was the publication, exactly this. It's a picture of the publication which brought this to the attention. It was a letter in the Lancet. Same. He just said, have any of your readers seen similar abnormalities in babies delivered who've taken this drug during pregnancy? That's all he said in this case report. So dramatically it's changed thousands and millions of lives. But look at this. Right? This is 1993. Thalidomide doctor guilty of medical fraud. So once he had decided that all these antiemetics cause anomalies, he got millions of dollars on research grants, he became very famous. He started chasing every antiemetic. And there was one drug called Devendox, and he published to say that this Devendox causes congenital anomalies and should be banned. And those claims were really not true. But he had become so famous and so fixated that people took him seriously, the drug never sold, and the company took him to court for malpractice. And then they found out that his questionnaires were a little dodgy, the data was incomplete, the research was a little fudged, the controls weren't as good as they should have been, and actually this drug is harmless. And he was sued and he was put behind bars and his reputation was destroyed. So a very important lesson is never be obsessed by your own research or your own bright idea. I mean, you hit something very great once, but don't push it to overtake the truth. Don't push it to overtake the science. Because ultimately the truth will prevail and science will prevail. And simple ideas actually can make a huge difference. This is another great man. I had the pleasure of actually meeting him. He is Dr. P.K. Sethi. He's developed the Jaipur foot. You've all heard of this Jaipur foot. It's a wonderful prosthesis, right, which allows people to squat. The solid ankle cushion heel, which was the old device, that is the British device, didn't have a flexible ankle. It was solid ankle. Well, British don't have to squat. They have the Western toilet. They can sit happily on it. They sit on chairs. They walk. They don't require it. But the Indian farmer, I mean, where's he going to get a Western bathroom from? So those devices were disastrous for Indians. Plus, they cost thousands of rupees. While this he made from old bicycle tire and bits of plastic and aluminium, and millions were fitted with this. So little bit of lateral thinking. The local thought, think about the Indian in the Indian environment. You need squatting, you need to be durable. And look at this. It is a foot. The solid ankle cushion heel had a boot. Now which Indian farmer wears boots? You can't have a boot on one leg and barefoot on the other. So these little bits of Indian thinking and the cheap cost have changed millions of lives across the world, and the maximum use of these feet have actually been in areas of Afghanistan where it will be fully mined, and people walk across those minefields and their legs get blown up, and hundreds of thousands of such people have been fitted with this, and this has changed more lives than probably all of us in the room put together can do in our own lifetime. So what is the ideal paper I wish I had written? Is it this beautiful evidence-based medicine, single blind, randomized controlled trial? Is it that single observation or an idea which can change so many lives? I would say it is any matter that tells us the truth. It doesn't matter whether it's complex, simple, magnificent in its design, simple in its conception. As long as you are advancing patient care, as long as you are advancing basic science, and you're closer towards the truth, whatever science you're doing is an ideal paper and something that I wish that I will always do. So I'll end at this point if there is anything.
Thank you, Sudeep. And any questions on all this?
Your email ID.
Is there
It's there at the bottom.
any comments, Ratan?
When you look at what is truth, first ask. Because 20 years ago when you were learning cornea, you realize corneal thickness is, you were taught corneal thickness in periphery is 1 millimeter, in the center is 0.5 millimeter. Because that was our limit of resolution. But today if I teach you corneal thickness is 1 millimeter in the periphery and 0.5 millimeter in the center, is our nonsense. That doesn't mean that you have known the truth. You know the path to the truth. But that is not the truth. So the most important point is find the path to the truth. Ultimately it will lead you somewhere.
As long as you're true in your work,
That's all.
you've done it sincerely, you've done it properly, you published it honestly, it is likely to be correct.
One which holds for a long
And it
period
will
of
go,
time.
because it is honestly done.
Yes, I think this is what I attended this 3-day high impact leadership acute care, and that's what we taught, learn to be honest. And I think and that's what all of us have to do in practice or
Difficult.
writing. No, I think if you make it as a habit, it's like any habit, like brushing the teeth. I mean, like honesty is also similar. It's difficult if you find to brush the teeth and you don't brush. So I think probably the philosophy is important for even writing a case report to publications. And I think that's what I'm probably enjoying. That's what I told Varun, that learning the set methodology and also how to write a paper will make you more meticulous in your day-to-day life, not only in writing paper, but treating a patient, maybe everything else. So thank you, Sudeep. And this is for a very brief, small black and white. Thank you. Alok, you wanted to talk before me? Yeah, you do that, because mine is I think almost covered by all. It's like boasting of IJO, which everybody knows. You want to talk, okay. So, Alok has something. Yeah, probably, I mean, I have all the email ID, and I'm also planning to put it in the